Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Funny thing happened on the way to the church this month. Did I do that? It's ringing a little bit. I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. Okay, thank you. First week of this month, I was called, and I feel like I'm blocking my view. Somebody said, hey, can you fill in and do the call for the offering? And I'm not going to embarrass anybody, but I was like, sure, no problem. Yeah, I'll do that. I've done it before. I'm going to be at church anyway, right? So the next week, somebody called me and said, can you do the prayer? I said, all right, yeah, I can do that. I'm going to be there again. Then the pastor called me and said, can you do the message on the third week? So if there's a Pathfinder patch for substitute of the month, I've probably earned it. And so, here I am. So before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank the church. Julie and I moved our membership here in 2009, and although we've done a little bit of church hopping since then, I want you to know that I really appreciate what the Kernersville Church has meant to us over the years. The friendships that we've formed, the support that we've received, the experiences that have enriched our spiritual journey, are memories that we will always treasure. And even though there's been some bad times mixed in with the good, I think it's all kind of worked together. And on that note, I would also like to extend my apologies to anyone who I've offended over the years, because sanctification is indeed the work of a lifetime. And unfortunately, familiarity often breeds contempt. So although this might not be exactly orthodox, I would just like to extend a symbolic foot washing to each of you personally. And in response, please partake of the Lord's Supper, knowing that there is peace between you and me and your families and mine. Several of you may already know that for about the first 20 years that I spent in my Adventist experience, I was a very involved behind-the-scenes person. I was head of the AV in Greensboro for about 8 years, and I was in AV for 12 years. And me and Brian DeFluter have conversations about that sometimes. I published the TCA yearbook for about 10 years and was the music arranger at another district for a little while, and was actually the head of the music department there for a year. So I'm not exactly a stranger to responsibility in the church, but for a long time I played more of a behind-the-scenes role. A few years back, I went through an experience that made me stop and evaluate where I was going spiritually. I became aware that I was supporting some incorrect ideas, and as a result, I resigned all of my church-related responsibilities and went on something of a sabbatical, which lasted probably 3 years. And during this time of reflection, I went through a phase where I rediscovered the beauty of the Adventist message. And as thankful as I was for that experience, it only served to underscore how disappointed I was in myself that I could have been deceived into supporting things which I knew I shouldn't have. Coming back into the mix later, I am especially thankful to several people who I won't embarrass by naming, but they know who they are, that have given me the opportunity as elder to make up for some of the mistakes I made in the past. I have tried to make it, I've tried to take it seriously despite my sometimes unusual sense of humor, and I know that Christ has taken the opportunity to show me how much more closely I need to walk with him every day. Some of you may have probably observed that I've never been one to hold back as a commentator in Sabbath school, but speaking in front is something of a new venture for me. Once I explained to a small group at the Mount Airy Church, one of the first times I ever spoke, we were in Ramona's garage. It was a perfect experiment for me because rather than speaking to 100 people, I was only speaking to 8 or 10. And I told them, I'm not a publicly trained speaker. And as I know most of the people in our church that are elders that are not, I'm really more sort of a researcher. I spend an awful lot of time looking into things that pique my interest. And this is why you'll see me, today I'm reading off my laptop. I don't have an AV presentation or anything like that. This is my notes, and I'm just reading my notes. It's like giving a book report. That's what I'm doing today. The few messages that I've presented so far have been subjects of personal interest, but I didn't select the topic of testimony today because I find myself particularly interesting. In fact, the more I review my life, especially my past, I often feel very embarrassed about the things that I've done, disappointed for the mistakes that I've made, and quite frankly, stupid for the opinions and aspirations I once held. And unfortunately, sad for some of the people that I've hurt. So to talk about this can be a little bit difficult. And also, testimonies can sometimes be misread and the wrong things be unintentionally glorified. So I hope I'm able to present this in a way that rightly divides the commentary to give the correct perspective. The only thing that allows me to deliver a message like this in peace is knowing that Jesus has forgiven me for my past and is working with me to finish what he started. And also that there is an element of salvation attached to it, as we are told that we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, which was read earlier. And I also want to appreciate everybody that was involved in the service today. I have really enjoyed the music that was picked out and all of the commentary that was made in between. And the children's story, you'll see, kind of ties into some of the things I'm going to present. I've done a lot of things as an artist over the years. And with that in mind, let's pray and ask God to bless our time. Father in heaven, please be with me as I present my story. You know, Lord, this is really your story, the ability to save regardless of where somebody's come from and what their past experiences have been. And I especially am happy to glorify the name of Jesus, as it's him who's brought me through this and not me myself. It's in his name I pray. Amen. It was February 1994, about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was on the road. Highway 95, somewhere between Savannah, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida. Everybody in the van was asleep or resting quietly except me and our sound tech, Kid. He was driving. At the last stop, we had all rotated seats, and I wound up in the front passenger side of the van, so it was sort of my job to keep him awake for the next segment of the trip. We each made an occasional comment to assure the other that we weren't dozing, but overall it was quiet. We were in the personnel carrier. It was an oversized 1980s sport van, one of those custom party vans with curtains, shag carpet, and seats that swivel 360 degrees. We were following the equipment truck. It was a 22-foot Penske Semi, which the band had purchased used, and it still had the sun-faded stripes where the rental company logos had been removed. We used it to carry all of our sound equipment, lighting truss, musical instruments, personal luggage, and power distribution. We carried enough electrical equipment to tie into the grid when necessary so that we didn't blow the circuits in any ill-prepared nightclub and take out their power, because that had happened from time to time. At night, the back seat of the van was folded into a double bed, and the middle row of chairs had been removed so that people could lie down on the floor and rest, maybe even sleep. Sleep was possible, but not particularly comfortable or sometimes even advisable, not because of the accommodations so much as the circumstances. Between the recreational chemical abuse and the long hours on the interstate, it was less than relaxing. One of our guitar players, Freddie, used to joke about not being able to sleep very well in the van because you might wake up dead. There were 5 musicians and 2 crew, a sound tech and a light tech, so we usually split the personnel between 2 people in the truck and the rest in the van. Our drummer, Joe, was driving the equipment truck, and Carl, our singer, was making sure he wasn't going to sleep. We had just left Jacksonville, North Carolina, where we had played for 3 nights in what was a combination live music and exotic dance club, a setup that seemed to be popular in the military towns. We were on our way to West Palm Beach, Florida, to do week in another club that we were familiar with. It was fairly normal for us to play several nights as the house band in one location before packing up to go somewhere else. Usually our dates ran from Wednesday or Thursday night until Saturday or Sunday night, and then we would pack up and travel on Monday and Tuesday. I was using a flashlight to read. I read a lot. Biographies, science, philosophy, popular fiction. It was a good way to kill time. I had a tendency to gravitate towards authors like Frank Herbert, Michael Crichton, Isaac Asimov, Stephen Hawking, Arthur C. Clarke. In college, I had read traditional Greek philosophy and science like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Einstein, Thomas More, René Descartes, and I was fascinated with pondering the universe and trying to understand why we were all here and what it all meant. At that time, I was switching back and forth between a college-level textbook on the science of chaos, math, and fractal geometry, and a book that someone had given me on creation science called Creation's Tiny Mystery, written by Dr. Robert Gentry, a Seventh-day Adventist. I'd been fascinated with science for a long time. I originally went to college to do engineering, but dropped out my third year to pursue music. I liked science, but it had become more of a hobby, and I had decided to put school on the back burner because I wanted to do something more hands-on while I was still young and had no obligations. I was at that time what some might qualify as a semi-professional musician. I had worked my way up from small-time local party bands to other more professional situations where we played across several cities within the state, to the current situation in which I was traveling regularly from one state to another, one nightclub to another in the southeastern United States. I made a set fee per show. My hotel accommodations were covered. Our band had a manager. We were booked through a talent agency. And in addition to playing what is referred to as cover material, which is music that you would hear on the radio, we were also regularly writing, recording, and composing music of our own. The idea, of course, with any band was to capture the attention of a producer somewhere or somebody important and eventually secure a record contract. So the situation I was in made me feel like I was making progress, and from a return on investment perspective, we were at a point where we were beginning to break even. Most of our equipment and vehicles were paid for, our concert dates were increasing, we had developed something of a small following, so we could usually count on a few regulars to show up in some of the clubs that we played at more frequently, while we continued to procure more dates in a broader, growing number of venues. I'd been living like this on and off for about 3 years, and I was happy, or at least I thought I was. As an Adventist now, I look back and think I was lost. If I had died, I would have woke up worse than dead, like in the wrong resurrection. It's crazy to imagine, but in retrospect, I had a lot of evidence that God was working very hard to get my attention. I was just ignoring him. I found religion or metaphysics at that point to be something of a hobby and enjoyed the opportunity to discuss and debate the various theories on origins with anybody who was interested. The distance I had traveled philosophically may as well have been from one side of the planet to the other. You see, I had attended a Baptist school in my youth, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to skip back a couple of generations to give proper context because my family certainly shaped who I am. 3 of my grandparents were in the Second World War. My mom's dad was an infantryman in the United States Army and served in North Africa, Germany, and other parts of Europe. He was under Patton's broader command, but he never met the guy. My dad's father was drafted into the Air Force when he was in his mid-20s and sent to the United Kingdom, where he was stationed in London as a driver. This is where he met my grandmother, who was a London native and was serving in the Royal Air Force, or Great Britain's Air Force. My dad was born in England during the war, and later in life he also served in the military. He did 3 years in the United States Army, served in Hawaii in the 1960s. He never saw action, although he only missed Vietnam by a couple of months. All of my uncles eventually served in some branch of the military in the 70s, and one was a 20-year veteran who retired from the Air Force in the 1990s. I was the first person in our family who didn't serve in the military, and so far no one else has. I was the firstborn of firstborns. My mom was 17, my dad was 23 when I came along in 1967. My parents were also the eldest children in their respective families, and both were significantly older than their siblings. My grandparents had started families when they were very young, so my grandparents were all in their late 40s or early 50s when I was just a baby. And this put me into something of an odd dichotomy because several of my aunts and uncles were really like older brothers and sisters, and later my cousins were more like nieces and nephews. So I didn't figure perfectly into either generation and spent most of my younger years as something of a lone child among adults. I do have a brother that's about 2.5 years younger, but for several years we were really basically it. And because of this, I developed a significant connection to the baby boomers as well as the Gen Xers without feeling like I belonged exclusively to either club. My subsequent very diverse age friendships through high school and college, and later my music endeavors, also caused me to form similar connections to people in the kids of the 1990s. I was very blessed to have known a broad spectrum of relatives, especially in a time when my family was so cohesive. There was no divorce in the extended family until I was considerably older. I knew all 4 of my great-grandmothers, including the one that lived in England. My parents and I flew to London in 1973, where I was able to meet my father's extended family. I also celebrated my 6th birthday there, and my Aunt Phyllis, who must have thought my southern accent was atrocious, spent a lot of time reading to me and correcting my English. So it's probably why I don't sound like a typical North Carolina native, even though I've lived here all my life. Growing up in rural North Carolina, however, did leave me with pleasant memories, and I now see these times as especially important from a spiritual perspective. Most of my family members built their own homes, had substantial gardens, and tried to exist in a somewhat independent manner. I realize now, based on my understanding of the spirit of prophecy, that this was a peek into what Adventists call country living, but we weren't Adventists. Growing up among veterans, I also observed a type of respect and honor that is very absent from today's culture. In those days, Protestant Christian morality was seen as very defined and important rather than fluid, open to debate, and non-essential, as it is now. The rewriters of history may account that as a type of advancement, but I see it as further evidence of a decline. It's a sad commentary on our direction as a people who originally set up a nation without a king and a church without a pope. But I was also exposed to a great deal of pop culture. My parents were both avid TV watchers, moviegoers, and music lovers. I grew up watching everything on television, from daytime soap operas and the Brady Bunch to afternoon game shows and Good Times. Green Acres, Mary Tyler Moore, Sanford and Son, Dragnet, MASH, and the original Star Trek series. Disney kid movies like The Apple Dumpling Gang and the original 101 Dalmatians. John Wayne Westerns, Clint Eastwood police dramas, the original Ian Fleming, James Bond. I even watched older TV shows with my dad like The Honeymooners and the Burns and Allen Show. My mother was a traditional country music fan, while my dad preferred the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and the Rolling Stones. But it also wasn't uncommon for them to play everything from disco and Motown to blues and pop. My parents would regularly have around 15 to 25 guests on any Friday or Saturday night. I remember being about 5 years old and waking up to music in the night, and I wandered into the living room, and there were all these people there. And some of them I knew, but not all of them. And I wouldn't qualify what they did as wild parties, but back in those days, it was not uncommon for people to get together and play cards or board games or watch sports or listen to music. My dad had converted our carport into a game room, and we had a billiard table and a dartboard there. There was cigarette smoking and alcohol, but people generally behaved. I was, of course, disoriented and couldn't find my mother. The young ladies present noticed this little toddler wandering around, and they notified my mom. She put me back to bed. It eventually became standard practice that my brother and I would stay with grandparents on the weekends so that my young parents could entertain guests without disturbing the children. My dad's parents went to church sporadically, so if I stayed with them, there were times we would go, but not usually, and not consistently. My mom's mom, on the other hand, went to church every Sunday, but her Christian experience was extremely shallow and often hypocritical. I don't remember a lot about those visits to church, but it might be a good thing. Coming up on my school years, with the popularity of Dr. Spock's baby book at that time and IQ tests being something of a fad, my mom decided to have me evaluated prior to entering school. Now, my score was only a little bit higher than average, but you know what that can do to a parent. The administrator of the test recommended a special school, which was under the broader umbrella of NC State University in Raleigh, but my dad, who was a regular working class guy, was not going to move to Raleigh. So in order to accommodate my mom's wishes, I was enrolled in a private school as a compromise. So I went to Community Baptist Elementary School in first grade, and it's still there in Reedsville if you guys ever want to visit. It was a good school. I had a really good experience there. While I was there, I was taught all of the standard Bible stories. We were encouraged to pray and read our King James Bible, which was the only translation allowed. We had a chapel-type assembly every Wednesday morning. I learned creation science, memorized scripture, sang hymns, was encouraged to develop a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Interestingly enough, the secret rapture was not taught at that time, or at least I don't remember it being taught. I was probably what Adventists might think of as a non-constituent student because my parents didn't go to church anywhere. While I was in first grade, my teacher, Miss Zabit, kept talking to the class about asking Jesus into our hearts. Now, you must understand that growing up around adults, I had a very different way of thinking, and I wasn't like a child, and I didn't get metaphors. I was a very serious, very literal child with an active imagination, and asking someone to come into my heart seemed a little strange, not to mention potentially dangerous. So I was kind of skeptical at first, and I had to really think about this for a while. But I remember being at home in my room by myself one afternoon, rolling this over in my mind, giving all the serious thought that a 6-year-old could to my teacher's yet constant appeal. I eventually decided to give it a try, So I prayed a prayer that day that I honestly didn't understand, but I think God sort of winked at my ignorance and respected my honesty. I was too young to understand what I was doing, and I don't even remember if I said it out loud or if I just prayed quietly to myself. But I firmly believe that as a result of my shallow, maybe even naive child conversion, that I was specially protected through my early years. I never had any major illness or injury. I wasn't abused by any of my relatives or adult acquaintances. My environment wasn't perfect, but I can't say that anything particularly bad ever happened to me as a child. Even when my parents separated for a year when I was in third grade, it was mostly handled in a way that had a more or less minimal effect on my brother and I. In general, I liked my teachers and had very few problems in my early years at school. But in sixth grade, I was beginning to grow tired of the rules and more interested in what I saw as being more normal. So I asked my parents to transfer me to public school the next year. As a young person, I developed a fascination with science and would regularly read books and watch documentaries on TV about all kinds of scientific subjects. Most of it was presented from an evolutionary perspective, as you can imagine, and I'm sure that played a large part in my worldview, which was beginning to drift. I was also indulging more in pop culture, listening more to the more promiscuous music of the late 1970s, watching a lot of murder mystery car chase television and movies, as well as listening to comedians that use bad language. But I hadn't completely abandoned my morals. I still sort of understood the idea of cause and effect as it related to spiritual things. I knew, even if it was only vaguely, that there were certain boundaries I shouldn't cross because I could be opening myself up to physical harm. And I know this might seem contradictory, but as I got older and eventually did start to experiment with drugs and alcohol, I was very careful about how far I went and who I did it with. Going into high school in the 1980s, it was a time of prosperity and big thinking. Optimism was on the rise despite the popularity of books like George Orwell's 1984. And the technology revolution was underway with the introduction of personal home computers. All this fascinated me and generated further interest in science. So I went to high school and later in college, and I pursued electronics, higher math, advanced chemistry and physics, and eventually enrolled in engineering, or what we now refer to as a STEM program. The high school I went to was new construction and at that time and somewhat state-of-the-art. It had a huge two-story library. We got Apple computers probably before anybody else. We had an electronics lab, a graphics department. We had our own print shop. We had a radio station, an auto mechanics garage that was probably twice the size as most of the schools around, and a competition-sized swimming pool. Learning to swim was a graduation requirement. And I knew at least a handful of students that falsified their address just to go there. So the facilities attracted a lot of people, almost like a magnet school or a charter school. I lived in an area that was a cluster of small towns, and I ran around with all kinds of people in my high school years. I tended to participate in various activities like weekend ball games at the surrounding schools, video game rooms in different cities, movies, concerts, a weekly karate class, skating several times a week in a couple of different rinks. And I even went to occasional events that were put on by my former Baptist school, like the Wednesday Night Awanas. My broader circle of friends included people of all stripes, types, and interests. I got along with pretty much everybody, and I almost never experienced conflict. In fact, I had so many friends that were from so many different groups that some of the groups didn't like each other, and I had a hard time understanding that because I just liked everybody. But as positive as these things may have been, the lack of biblical morals that ensued over the next several years just served to advance the idea that indulgence in world culture was inconsequential. I had family members and friends that watched everything on television, listened to anything on the radio, went to questionable movies and concerts, and most of them professed to believe in God or the Bible. Some even went to church regularly, and most drank socially or smoked. So in my mind, if these people were Christian, it all must be okay. So it just kind of made me view strict adherence to the Bible as being less and less important. Music was a big part of the crowd that I ran with, my closer friends. And most of them were avid listeners with big car stereos, expensive home systems. We were all going to these big arena concerts fairly regularly, and several of us were sort of connoisseurs of certain bands and or genres and had developed large record collections along with other memorabilia. But being in this mix, I became interested in going beyond the idea of just being a spectator. The bands at that time looked like they were having fun and obviously getting paid for what appeared to be almost nothing, so I started to wonder, how hard could it be? For better or worse, I've usually been pretty good at figuring some things out on my own. I had a couple of guitar lessons, but once I learned that all you really have to do is copy what you hear, well, the rest was easy after that. And by the time I was finishing high school and going into college, a few of my friends and I had put a band together and we started playing at parties. My spiritual interests were rapidly declining, but I think that God was being especially merciful to me still. By this point in time, I had several friends that had been in trouble with the law, and I was beginning to participate in activities that could have gotten me into just as much trouble. I was pulled over drunk on more than one occasion and just let go. I don't know why. The best I can figure is that they either didn't figure it out or they were too busy with bigger problems. But I probably should have been arrested several times. And as I look back, all I can figure is it must have been a miracle. And I want to be very careful about not glamorizing this because I don't know why God protected me. I did lose my license on 2 occasions and I was arrested once. And I had several other near misses that could have been far, far worse than they were. And I especially don't want this to be misinterpreted by our youth because what I was doing with my life at this point was embarrassingly stupid. I look back on this time and deeply regret what I was doing to my parents who were investing in my education and what I was ultimately doing to myself because I lost time and multiple opportunities that I will never get back. It was extremely foolish, and yet God in his infinite mercy protected me from things that could have been a whole lot worse than they were. By my 3rd year of college, I was enrolled in civil engineering in the NC State University, and I was actually in the process of transferring over into aerospace. I only had like a 0.15 grade point average to make up to get there, and I was tracking that direction. And I was, for the most part, at least achieving my academic goals, but without going into a lot of detail, I was also going through some family and friendship struggles that were taking a toll on me emotionally, and it proved to be more than I could handle. So that year I did something, probably the dumbest thing I ever did in my life, was I dropped out of college. But as strange as it might sound, even then I look back and see how God was still trying desperately to salvage these bad choices. I started working for a small television station, which at least introduced me to some of the graphic technology that would eventually be a big part of my career path later. Within a year, I went to work for an individual that owned several visual arts businesses doing entry-level graphic design. Throughout this time, however, I was obsessed with becoming a professional musician, and I only viewed my day job as a way to bankroll that project. I figured I could always go back to school later, and within about 2 years, I had worked myself from one band to another until I finally landed in the traveling situation that I described earlier. By that time, I had made arrangements with my day job to be something of a floating employee, so I would work at my legitimate job for a month or 2 at a time, and then I would be gone on the road for between 2 weeks and a couple of months at a time. Looking back, I don't know how I stayed employed because the business owner really liked me and he was actually trying to promote me into better positions in his graphics business, but I treated it largely with indifference. I felt like I had made so much progress in the music world and I was just living like I wanted to, so I didn't want to think about anything serious. I had the best of both worlds, I thought. I had a flexible day job with a steady income. I was living the rock and roll party life. I came and went as I pleased, and most of the people around me probably saw me as content with my situation and maybe even lucky to have schemed my way into such an exciting and carefree life. But deep down, I knew the whole thing was precariously balanced, and it was just too good to last. Or maybe these thoughts on the edge of my consciousness were simply the Spirit of God trying desperately to wake me up from this illusion and deliver me from this wrong path in order to show me what true happiness was if I would only listen. Not long before I joined the road band, I met a former Seventh-day Adventist. This person worked with me at my day job, and they weren't especially excited about the church, but through my conversations with them over time and occasional contact with their family members, I was introduced to the beliefs and practices of the church. Now, this steady stream of information was not uninteresting to me. I was surprised to learn that there was a church that actually kept Sabbath. And like so many people, I had always wondered why Christians weren't to church on Sunday when the Bible clearly said Saturday. It was like they couldn't read or something. As a child in the Baptist school, I had overlooked things like that, but as I got older, it was these little inconsistencies that made me view Christianity as being unintelligent and little better than any other relativistic philosophy. I learned that Adventists were health conscious and that they believed in a prophet named Ellen White, and maybe I'm just different, but none of that bothered me. Even when this person told me a little bit about the beast power, it kind of made sense because it fit with what I knew about history. At some point, curiosity must have gotten the better of me, or maybe this person felt the need to explain their family's weird religion. I don't remember which, but Somehow or other, they loaned me a book called Project Sunlight, which is written by an author named June Strong. Now, it's a sharing book, and it's in the form of a fictional story about someone who is converted at near the end of time, goes through the time of trouble, and is eventually translated at the second coming. So it describes some of the more prominent features of Adventist eschatology, beliefs, and lifestyle in the format of a novel. Now, I read it and sort of filed the information away as interesting, and the theology is potentially true. Later, a relative of theirs discovered that I was interested in science, so they loaned me the book by an Adventist geologist named Dr. Robert Gentry called Creation's Tiny Mystery, which, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the books that I was reading in the van that night. So there I was on the road reading my little book, living my escape, playing this psychological game with myself, pretending to be happy, pretending to be smarter and cooler and more confident in my chosen life path than other people who obviously couldn't get it together. Gently but persistently resisting the voice of God, while at the same time tempted to entertain this strange curiosity that maybe there was some truth in the Bible after all. But my well-rehearsed answer was to treat the whole thing like it was just another trivial novelty. And besides, all my life's focus and interest at that time was in the hope that something significant would finally come out of all this effort I'd put into the music venture. So I didn't even want to give it a second thought. Trying to shake off the overwhelming seriousness of it all, I read on, trying to distract myself back into my comfortable coma of armchair philosophy that had proved to be such an effective escape for me for so long. But I was tired, my mind was drifting, my thoughts were being pulled in several directions at once. I was trying to evaluate all of these disconnected points of interest. It all swirled in my head like an endless stream of data that only served to promote an endless sea of questions, but no real answers. It was so late, and the day had been so long, and we were so far away from home and our destination. All these thoughts kept rolling through my brain like a daydream, and I was beginning to drift off when suddenly I heard kids say, "Whoa!" and I felt the van slow down. I looked up, and I couldn't see the road. We were engulfed in black smoke, and he picked up the mic on the CB radio and was talking to Joe in the truck. Everybody woke up. Both vehicles pulled over, and we all went outside. It was cold, and there was steam and smoke coming out of the Penske truck. The engine was blown. It was a head gasket. We discovered later it had been sabotaged, but that's another story. In the meantime, we were stuck out on the freeway in the middle of the night with thousands of dollars worth of musical equipment and no way to move it. Calling for a tow truck in the middle of the night in a time without cell phones was a little bit more complicated than it is now, especially on a Sunday night. We had to find a phone booth, but we were in between cities, so we had to drive about 30 minutes just to get to one. Long story short, it took about 2 hours to get to a phone, find somebody willing to help, and meet them back at our disabled vehicle, and then tow it to their secured car lot before looking for a place to sleep. Now, being on something of a budget, we did what any group of guys would in their 20s to save money. We pulled into a local self-serve car wash bay and slept in the van. That is, until a police car woke us up at 6:30. The next morning, we rented another truck. Actually, I charged $300 on my personal credit card to bail out this temporary setback. We made it in time to play our week in West Palm Beach and the following week in Jacksonville, Florida. But before this series of events, tensions within the band had been running high. The 2 weeks in Florida and the compounded stress of a vehicle loss proved to be the last straw. 3 people quit after that excursion, and the process of trying to replace personnel and rebuild our momentum proved unfruitful. The whole project completely disbanded within about a year. We were all getting older, and we had other personal situations and career opportunities that were crowding out our ability to resource the time and money required for this kind of pursuit. So God finally had my attention. This turn of events reshuffled everything I was doing, and it removed a lot of the distractive, escape-oriented elements in my life, and allowed me to see that I was surrounded with other far more worthwhile opportunities than I realized, which were actually blessings from God that He had appointed for my true happiness and fulfillment in life. So I went back to school as planned, but not for engineering. I had gotten so much experience in the Apple and Adobe software world that I decided to get credentials for what I was already doing. And my stumbling into the graphic design business was a whole nother story, which was filled with seeming coincidences, but I'm positive now that they were all divinely arranged. And around that time, my Adventist friend and I decided we'd get married. So we met the local Seventh-day Adventist pastor to make arrangements. Now, I had no preference on the venue, but when they allowed us to use the church building for free, I decided maybe we should attend just to be polite. So I didn't walk into an Adventist church because I was exactly searching or because I had somehow been impressed with the message, because I didn't really know what the message was at that time. But I was a person with a little bit of information and an open mind. What I did know is that Adventists were different. And again, this may sound kind of funny, but it was the idea that Adventists were so unafraid of being different that really piqued my interest. And as I began to study the message, the doctrines, the history, the spirit of prophecy, the practical aspects of things like health reform, it all checked out. All this coupled with the fearlessness to be different, I felt a kinship, because the idea of being true to your convictions, regardless of how other people thought of you, was what seemed to be missing from so many of my Christian friends that I'd met in the past. My rock and roll friends, by comparison, well, they all knew what they believed and they lived it. That's why it had been so attractive to me as a lifestyle, because at least it was authentic. The Adventist Church was the first denomination I'd ever encountered that had people that were actually following the Bible without making up unrelated practices which had no foundation in Scripture. And even though it wasn't why I started attending, it provided a most convincing reason to stay. You see, I didn't grow up Adventist, so I'm not blindly attached to the culture like it's my family honor to defend or my colloquial duty to protect any elephants in the room. And I sincerely appreciate that when I first came into the church, I didn't get some watered-down, fluffed-up, cautiously worded version of the message that was intentionally engineered to make me comfortable and tiptoe around my potential fears and idiosyncrasies to make sure I wasn't offended. And if I had been approached that way, I wouldn't have respected it. And I probably wouldn't have stayed. In fact, the people I met on the way into the church were so excited to tell me about the Sabbath, the second coming, the state of the dead, the spirit of prophecy, the sanctuary, things like Daniel 2, Revelation 13, creation science, vegetarianism, appropriate music, modest dress, that they made me want to believe it. Not just because of the high level of enthusiasm, but what made it all so credible was the fact that they were living these principles. And it changed my life. It makes me very sad to see where our denomination has come in the 30 years since then. Today, people are uncomfortable hearing Ellen White quoted in a sermon, or they're squirmish during a presentation on the beast power, or they're even offended by something as simple as using Adventist insider lingo around a guest. We've become too politically correct, and I don't think we understand that these are things which can actually attract people in, because it creates a breadcrumb trail for them to investigate, and it's actually a technique that Jesus himself used. Conversely, I find it pathetically sad that some of our churches and other institutions now feel like they have to sink to the level of baiting people in by serving coffee and donuts, dressing down for the Sabbath, promoting adornment, and playing rock music disguised with Christian lyrics. This advertising strategy promotes the wrong idea about who we really are, and I think we need to stop using this kind of candy when we could be using whole wheat bread. I was actually part of the celebration movement for about 8 years, and this idea that we need to bring the standards down to meet the lost, I didn't see it working. I didn't see people coming in and embracing the actual Adventist message or even staying very long. What I did witness from week to week amounted to a feel-good TED Talk that promoted the illusion that because Jesus loves you so much, you can live any way you want, even to the point of allowing for an occasional glass of wine. My observation is that it was exactly what Ellen White refers to as false charity, and it isn't the path to unity, but I'll just leave it at that. It is my belief that if we would all just get away from this stuff, trust God, and simply present the straight testimony more boldly and without so much reservation, especially on Sabbath, it would not only revive us out of our Laodicean state, but it would actually bring true unity and unencumber the Spirit to empower us to reach the people out there who actually will be unafraid to embrace the real truth once they see it. I can only tell you that as an Adventist outsider, I know what attracted me into the church and what made me stay. And it wasn't the entertainment value of the music or free coffee and donuts or permission to continue in sin. It was a people who loved me with such an honesty that they were willing to level with me and tell me that I was on my way to perdition. And then when they introduced me to Christ, they did explain that although he accepted me for who I was, I needed to change in order to maintain that relationship with him. In closing, I would just like to say that Jesus is coming soon, And it is my testimony that it was his leading that brought me into the church, and it was his divinely appointed message for our time that convinced me to stay. So don't fall for these ideas that times are changing and we need to change with them, or that the message itself is somehow flawed or incomplete, or that there's some kind of secret remnant of a remnant to join that has newer, fresher information. Revelation does not present a church after the Laodiceans or some cleverly hidden subcategory therein. It only says that the individuals that make up the last day church will be sorted based on their willingness to completely submit to Christ, heed his warning, especially about the coming controversy over the Sabbath. So don't let anyone fool you into thinking that present truth is some other message. If we would only just stick to the tried and true faith that was once delivered to the saints and preach what we were originally told, what the pioneers and early Adventists proclaimed, and adjusted as new light from the spirit of prophecy was revealed, and get away from all these sensationalistic, culturally driven, transitory, or secret-coded deceptions of every wind of doctrine, I think the Lord would bless our efforts, and we could begin to look up with confidence and expectation for divine deliverance, both for ourselves and those we are witnessing to and the ones we are praying for. In a lot of ways, it's up to us. God is ready anytime.